Hello, welcome to the channel. I'm Matthew Millais. Today we're talking about Watchtower and asking the question, a potential, or let's just get straight into it, Watchtower corporate takeover with a question mark. So what is the question exactly? Could Watchtower be taken over by an outside corporation? So what am I exactly suggesting here? Am I suggesting that Watchtower is currently or was being taken over? Well, I'm actually asking a very different kind of question. So if somebody wanted to take it over, could they? What exactly would they be buying? Would they be purchasing a religion or corporation or a collection of legal entities? What exactly is it that they would be acquiring? Is it a worldwide brand? Is it intellectual property assets, or some combination of all of these things? Even perhaps you've got subscribers in a way, persons that you could say have particular interests that you could say are prone to supporting certain purchases, maybe cell phones or maybe tablets, for instance. So I'll just put that into mind. So let's move along on the conversation. We've got could Watchtower survive even if the religion became the brand? Well, is that so hard to believe that could happen? Look, this is a thought experiment about religion, corporations, and institutional survival. So let's take a look at number one here. What if the religion became a brand? What if? So let me begin with a question. What would happen if the Watchtower organization eventually became more valuable as a brand, an institutional structure, than as a religious movement? You know, this is a question that you could say organically comes up when you see certain patterns. So I want to be very clear from the beginning here. I'm not claiming that, oh yes, Watchtower has been secretly taken over by a corporation, nor am I claiming that such a takeover is currently taking place. So taking place or had taken place. Let's just explore the scenario. We're free to talk about it. So imagine an organization that began as a religious movement. And Watchtower is a great example of this, because what you see in Watchtower, you could say, is a microcosm of scenarios that happen elsewhere. It really is a very useful study in this. So there's the organization. It begins as a religious movement, and then it accumulates enormous institutional resources over more than a century, 140 years plus, right? It develops this sophisticated legal power, this legal corporations, acquired property, intellectual property, and it establishes a recognizable worldwide brand, and eventually finds itself facing a very challenging, you could say, membership or associate situation and a changing technological environment. So at what point does the survival of the institution become inseparable, or become separable rather, from the survival of the religious movement that created it? And I'm talking about the people that support this movement. But also, you could say, the controller part, the leadership, the real leadership. Maybe it's unseen, maybe it's seen. I don't want to get into that. But there is something provocative in this study. There's a provocative question. Could the religious identity eventually become something like the mask of an institution whose primary objective is simply to preserve itself? So that's the key thought experiment that I'm wanting to explore here. So here's an example: IKEA. Yes, the furniture that you put together yourself, kind of like Lego. So consider something like IKEA. So we generally think of IKEA as that furniture company. But IKEA is also a brand. It's a system of intellectual property, trademarks, corporate structures, suppliers, real estate, distribution systems, technology, customer relations, and accumulated institutional knowledge. If you want to think of Liechtenstein and control there, and you want to think of the way that is set up, there's something very, very interesting in this particular company that we can learn from in discussing or unfolding this thesis, or examining or producing this thesis. So the furniture itself is important. Yes, that's what it's about. But the underlying corporate architecture is enormously valuable in its own right. Now imagine applying that concept cautiously, of course, to Watchtower, right? So that's what we're doing here. That's what we're examining. Okay? Instead of furniture, let's imagine the Watchtower name. For those that are familiar, that would be jw.org, for instance. That would come into it. The publications, the trademarks, the intellectual property or property holdings, the legal entities, the institutional knowledge, the worldwide infrastructure, and an established community. So the question becomes, how much of the institution's value depends upon the truth of its theological claim or claims? So that's a very different question from asking whether the religion itself is spiritually legitimate. So what are the mechanisms? What's the psycho-spiritual mechanisms? Maybe they're all legitimate. As you zoom out and you see that the principles can be applied to many different systems. A corporation doesn't need to believe a theology. That is, in order to understand the value of the established institution. And that distinction is central to this thought experiment, or to this working thesis, as I call it. So let's look at the third slide here. Watchtower is already a layered organization. We've seen it. There's all kinds of names involved in the various instrumentalities that make up this organization. So there's another reason that this question is interesting, it's engaging. Watchtower isn't simply one enormous corporation. We've seen that. It's this web, this intricate web, this complex web that makes it up. So Jehovah's Witnesses themselves, you could say the core believers, the core supporters, all right, themselves describe a number of cooperating legal entities around the world, while distinguishing those legal corporations from the religious governing body. You could say top leadership. And don't separate the legal corporation. So those things go together. The legal corporation, I say, in my opinion, is like the unseen extra member of the governing body. And that tells us something very, very important, because the religious authority and the legal corporate structure can be conceptually separated. So it doesn't mean that they're secretly operating independently, though, don't discount that either. It doesn't mean that there's a conspiracy, though, of course, don't discount that as well. But in order to produce the thesis responsibly, we can focus in on something else. It does mean that the architecture already exists for us to ask the interesting question. What happens when the spiritual organization and its corporate machinery become increasingly distinct? That's the fourth slide. So the institution can outlive its original environment. So that happens throughout history. We've got examples of this. So institutions can survive the circumstances that created them. So a company can survive its founder. A university can survive its original professors. A political organization can survive the moment that established it. A church can survive the generation that created it. We've discussed this on the channel. We've even had some guests who've written books about this kind of concept. So look, without pointing to one particular conclusive thing here, a religious corporation can potentially survive major changes in the religious environment that originally produced it. And that's the fascinating characteristics of institutions, isn't it? So they can develop their own momentum. They can accumulate buildings. They can establish legal structures. They can develop procedures. They can train administrators. They can create archives, immense archives. They produce brands. They establish them. They acquire intellectual property, even produce it. They develop the financial systems. And eventually the institution itself becomes something that needs to be preserved. You could even say that it's shaping the legal system. It contributes to that. And therefore shapes society. Think freedom of speech. So at that point, what do we distinguish? We distinguish between preserving the faith and preserving the organization that represents the faith. Those are not necessarily identical objectives. So shall we move to the fifth slide? So what happens if membership declines? Well, let's introduce another variable. Okay, suppose membership declines significantly over several decades. Suppose fewer young people join, or older members, I say associates, maybe they die. Suppose some former members leave. Suppose donations decline. Suppose fewer volunteers are available. And suppose the enormous infrastructure that was built during the organization's period of expansion becomes increasingly expensive to maintain. So the organization then faces a very ordinary institutional problem, doesn't it? What's that? How do we survive with fewer resources? That we're creating the expansion. Maybe we should add that. Now we already know some of the answers. Reduce your costs, sell or consolidate property, centralize your operations, move publishing online, produce a media center, even get persons to rent facilities or pay for those facilities. So there's a commercial side. reduce your physical infrastructure, let's say dependencies or things that draw monies. Try and automate, streamline your administration, and protect your valuable intellectual property. Then go towards strengthening your central brand. None of those actions requires a conspiracy. It doesn't. They're simply organizational responses that we see all over the place. Why? Because you've got changing circumstances. Welcome to planet Earth. So let's go on to our sixth slide. We've got the great transformation from publishing empire to digital brand. This isn't a new discussion. But there is an especially interesting transformation that's going on here. So for much of its history, Watchtower was what? Fundamentally a publishing organization. There's books, there's magazines, boom, there it is, right? Even producing movies. So you've got millions of books, magazines produced, distributed. You've got your volunteers distributing this. I mean, what a machine. That requires enormous physical infrastructure. Printing facilities, warehouses, shipping, local distribution, trucking, physical kingdom halls, even airplanes. But the digital revolution does what? Changes the economics completely. Wham, bam, done, right? So today, what have you got? You have a website that can distribute an enormous quantity of material worldwide at negligible marginal costs. All right. So imagine the organization continuing to evolve. The printing empire becomes less important. The physical infrastructure becomes less important. And the digital platform becomes increasingly important. So at that point, what have you got? JW.org in this examination. It itself becomes one of the organization's most important assets. And that begins to look surprisingly similar to a modern media organization. To many, this is no revelation. To some, it may be. Let's move on to the seventh slide. What exactly is the valuable asset? So I want to propose, I think the thought experiment here, the working thesis, this is where it becomes particularly interesting, because if we stripped away the theology just for a moment and we look purely at organizational assets, what do we find? We might find a globally recognized name. We might find a recognizable visual identity. We might find a massive archive of publications. Hey, look at this. A sophisticated website. Wow. Translation infrastructure. Ooh. You know, intellectual property, real estate, legal entities, a worldwide network, institutional knowledge, and a database of organizational procedures. And add to that, you've got a community of people who identify with the brand and decades of accumulated reputation. So now ask, which of these things disappears if somebody stops believing in the theology? The answer is interesting, because the buildings don't disappear, the website doesn't, the trademarks don't disappear, and the archives don't just vanish. The intellectual property stays. The legal structures don't disappear. And the organizational knowledge doesn't just go. So this creates the fascinating divergence, or at least the possibility of this divergence. So the spiritual legitimacy of the organization could theoretically decline while the institutional assets remain. Should we move on to the 8th slide here? It's titled The Religion as Institutional Identity. So here we need to be careful with the word mask. So if I say that religion becomes a mask, that sounds as though somebody was consciously knowing the religion's false, folks. It's false, and it's just deliberately being used to deceive people. Now, people are people are people. There may be some who absolutely know this. They may get into power positions, but there may be some who absolutely don't know about that. So it's difficult. That's part of the problem. But at least we've named it. So we don't have actual, can I say, evidence for that. We don't have it. Okay, there's ambiguity. But there's another way to describe the phenomenon. Okay, so religion can become an institutional identity system. So the organization says, oh, we're Jehovah's Witnesses. We have a particular history. We have a particular theology. We have a particular understanding of divine authority. Right? Know this song? Know this tune? We have a particular community. So those beliefs provide the identity that holds the institution together. But over time, the institution may also develop objectives that are simply organizational survival. Okay? It's financial stability. It's legal protection. It's property management. It's risk management, public reputation, and theological adaptation and continuity. How do we carry on? The interesting question is, what happens if those institutional imperatives gradually become more important than the original religious environment? Slide 9. Could an outside corporation take it over? Ooh, what a question. What a question. Let's repeat it. Could an outside corporation take it over? Now, we reach the most dramatic version of the hypothesis. Could a company simply buy Watchtower? Now, I think it's perhaps relatively unlikely. Why? Because Watchtower's legal structures are religious and non-profit in nature. But though I say this, okay, you could say it was structured to serve the same cause in its inception. As soon as it becomes a 501c. Anyway, hold on to those things. Let's just keep it in mind. Okay? So Watchtower's legal structures are religious and non-profit in nature. Okay, fine. So what does that mean? It means that there's legal restrictions surrounding charitable and religious corporations. But what about the other instrumentalities that it uses? So that's why I say keep that other point in mind. Because what exactly would a company be buying? There's all kinds of things on offer. Could be computer programs that are developed, could be music, could be media, could be, let's say, instrumentalities that deal in, let's say, asset liquidation. Yeah. So there are many things that can come from such a sophisticated system that's been built over 140 years. So the question, what exactly would a company be buying? Many things. But you can't simply purchase millions of human beings. Can you? Can you? Can you purchase someone's religious belief? You see, you can't purchase the entire concept of Jehovah's Witness identity. But what about pieces of it? Right? Okay. So you might acquire particular assets or corporate entities. That's a very different thing from buying a religion outright. And that's why this is a complex thing. Okay. So coming back to IKEA, I would give a literal IKEA style corporate takeover a relatively low probability, okay, in that form. But that doesn't mean that the underlying scenario is impossible, because there's another possibility. Slide 10. Ready for this one? The takeover that doesn't look like a takeover. Huh? Yeah. What if nobody actually buys Watchtower? What if the organization simply evolves? Imagine this sequence. Okay? Membership, associates, declines. Bzzz, plummets on the graph. Okay? Your physical infrastructure contracts. Okay? Your publishing becomes digital, and your administration becomes increasingly centralized. I mean, writing staff reduced, that kind of thing. Your property gets consolidated. Your technology becomes more important, right? And your legal entities become increasingly important. So, what happens to your brand? Your brand becomes increasingly important. The organization becomes smaller, but more efficient. It's even got, let's say, intricate, special AIs doing a lot of administration here. What's going on? Efficiency. Eventually, the surviving institution consists primarily of what? Brand, website, intellectual property, legal structure, property, financial infrastructure, and community identity. Has anybody taken it over? No. There's no secret boardroom. There's no drastic acquisition in that scenario. But functionally, the organization may have transformed from a mass religious movement into something much closer to a global legacy institution managing a historic religious brand. Think museums, folks. Think museums. So that, to me, is considerably more plausible. But I'm open to ideas here. Let's look at slide 11. What would happen to spiritual legitimacy? We have discussed this on the channel because we arrive at the deepest question. Suppose somebody could demonstrate that the organization has lost the religious authority. Oh, has that happened? Has that happened with, let's say, French brethren holding, let's say, a judicial meeting or an enactment based upon the religion's own rules? Think about that. And has it only happened in France? See? So with more and more people connected, let's say, by the internet system, it's demonstrated, yes, the organization has lost its religious authority that it once claimed, be it through medicine, 98% taking a certain medicine, and it being discovered, oh, hang on, there's a problem with this spiritually. Within the rules of that religion, of course. Let's just make that very, very clear. Okay, so we're not condemning a medicine or something like this. We're just saying within the rules of that system, it loses its religious authority. Okay, for many reasons. So that's just part of it. But with the discussions, we say no. 98% more. It's lost its religious authority. What happens to the machinery? We've already asked these questions. Does the machinery disappear? No, it's there. Okay, we say not necessarily. It's tangible. So an institution can continue to exist even after its founding justification has been seriously challenged. So that's why I think we need to distinguish between two questions. Because some persons say, oh, tower has fallen, tower has fallen. Had somebody comment about this, the governing body recently, and they made an astute observation. They said, well, didn't the governing body say that they, as a governing body, their presence would disappear or something along those lines, that they would no longer be there? Well, let's talk about, is the organization spiritually legitimate? That's the question. And next question, can the organization continue functioning as an institution? I think we already see a difference. Okay, those questions can have very, very different answers. So an organization could theoretically experience declining belief, psycho-spiritual legitimacy, but maintain enormous institutional continuity. And perhaps that is one of the greatest challenges facing any high control religious organization. How does an institution survive when the certainty that originally justified the institution begins to disappear or disappears? Let's go on to the 12th slide, and that's the final question. And you know what happens in our final question? We return to the original question. Could Watchtower eventually survive as a brand, even if the religious movement that created the brand became dramatically smaller or fundamentally changed? One of those things. So I think that is a much more plausible scenario than an actual corporation simply going and saying, well, let's purchase this thing, let's take it over, let's purchase Watchtower. Corporate takeover scenario. Yeah, coming back to IKEA, right? Because the IKEA comparison, again, it's not perfect, but I mean in terms of comparison, it's useful because, or I should say, not because Watchtower is literally like IKEA, but because it helps us separate. There's a brand, there's an infrastructure, there's institutional assets from the beliefs that originally created these. So the real thought experiment is this. What happens when a religious movement becomes an institution? Oh, I thought it already is an institution. Yeah. Next question. What happens when that institution accumulates enormous assets? Right? What happens when your membership or your associates declines? What happens when your technology makes much of its historic infrastructure unnecessary? And what happens when the legal corporation can be separated from the religious leadership? Let's even say that the spiritual authority that they had, they've cut themselves off from psycho-spiritually. Finally, what happens when preserving the organization becomes easier than preserving the certainty that originally gave the organization its authority? Hey, we're on the clock here. Any moment now, time is running up. What happens? Finally, I want to say, what happens when preserving the organization in terms of its future wasn't an IKEA-style takeover at all? Maybe it's something much... maybe it's something that happens behind the scenes. You don't see it so clearly. It's not right in front of your face. It's interesting. Because the transformation of a religious movement into the custodian of its own historic brand captures our interest. If it were to happen, the most important question wouldn't be, oh, who owns Watchtower? What if there's a corporate takeover? It would be, what exactly is left when an organization survives longer than the certainty that created it? Thank you for listening. Remember, you are the reason we are here. Please go well.